Hello, thanks for tuning in to the third installment in Missouri Prairie Foundation's Prairie webinar series. I'm Felicia Ammon. I'm the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation. Today, we are going to hear from Sarah Kendrick, the Missouri State Ornithologist, on the Missouri Bird Conservation Plan. Sarah Kendrick works for the Missouri Department of Conservation as your state ornithologist. Sarah is a Missouri native and earned her undergrad degrees from the University of Missouri. She received her master's degree studying eastern wood pewee breeding demography on savanna and woodland restoration sites in the Missouri Ozarks. Sarah was an outreach and marketing coordinator for MDC's Wildlife Division for 3 years before landing her dream job of state ornithologist in 2017. Sarah loves bird watching, hiking, her husband Kip, and their 4-year-old son Abram, but not in that order. Be sure to check out the rest of our webinar series that runs on Wednesdays at 4 p.m., now extended through June. Next week, we have Steve Klubine talking about managing invasives in livestock pastures. And after Steve's presentation in June, we will begin our Grow Native webinar series. So check the website for more details on that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me, Felicia? All good? Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. I think Felicia told me that there are 360 something people, so I don't know how many people actually tuned in. I don't know if that speaks to your boredom or your interest in bird conservation. We will go with the latter. But I am very appreciative and humbled that you would take time out of your day to talk about a conservation plan. So I will make this as entertaining as humanly possible. But I really appreciate your tuning in. It's an exciting thing that we have done over the last few years, and I'm excited to talk to you about it. So yes, I'm Sarah Kendrick. I'm your state ornithologist, and I'm very humbled to be that. So happy to be here today. Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of context about this is what we're going to talk about today. So why this, why now, why do we need a bird plan? What is the Missouri Bird Conservation Plan? How is it put together? How is it built? How can the plan be used? And then what's next? So the Missouri Bird Conservation Plan, henceforth, I will call it the bird plan, has a technical section and an outreach section. So the technical section is just what it sounds like. It's technical. It focuses on land management during the breeding season for our most threatened species. It targets our management efforts and serves as a reference guide to land managers, both on public lands and private lands. And then our outreach section does the same thing. It targets all those good outreach efforts we're doing across the state with many different organizations and targets it to some high-level key messages on what we want to get out to the public as a unified voice. So I'll go through a lot of this in detail. So today, mostly I'm going to be focusing on the technical section because it is the section that is complete. We have been working on it for the last 1.5 years. But what does the technical section do? It provides a reference for land managers, again, on both public and private land. It provides a Missouri concern score, which just means it outlines our most threatened species in the state, land birds, which is our species that spend most of their life cycle on land as opposed to water birds, waterfowl, shorebirds, water birds. And so it focuses on land birds during the breeding season, and it gives them a score to give context of just how threatened they are, because we really didn't have a reference guide of which species are most threatened. And then there's so many good land management efforts going on in our state across organizations, agencies, private lands, that we really wanted to focus those efforts to increase breeding habitat. So we assign broad management guidelines by species, which means we say what each species needs for quality breeding habitat. And then we identified future research and monitoring needs statewide. So lastly, again, is to inform our land managers and the public just how important this work is to our land birds, because they're in some trouble. They're declining a lot, and so this effort and this work, land management, is so necessary for many of these species. So why the heck do we need a bird plan at all, a statewide bird plan? So this is one reason why. So you see the NABC logo, that's the North American Bird Conservation Initiative. The State of Canada's Birds report came out in July of 2019, and it showed these long-term, widespread trends in bird populations since 1970, because that's when the breeding bird survey really began robustly across North America. And so this is just Canada's data, but it shows that since 1970, all of these trends have occurred. So we have seen some positive things. We've seen 150% increase in waterfowl. That's due to concentrated, concerted conservation efforts, largely by waterfowl hunters, but also wetland and waterfowl conservation groups. But a lot of concentrated effort by hunters, 110% increase in birds of prey, likely due to the banning of DDT and other things like that that were very negatively affecting raptor populations. But then we see some pretty stark declines, large declines in our grassland birds, 57% decline in grassland birds over this 50 years in Canada alone, and then 59% decrease in aerial insectivores. So some major things going on here. Again, this is just Canada. Then in September of 2019, it was kind of a depressing 3 months there. Ken Rosenberg and a lot of other great minds in the ornithological field came out with an article in the journal Science called The Decline of North American Avifauna. And they quantified these trends. So over the last few decades, ornithologists have known that birds have been declining. But these scientists really put the data, pencil to paper, computer model, lots of computer models running, to quantify that net loss. So they found that bird loss since 1970 equaled 2.9 billion birds lost, or about 29% of all North American birds have been lost. Those are in different bird guilds. There's a lot of detail in this study. It's not just that simple of 30% of all birds across the board. Certain guilds have been impacted more than others, and that's what this article and these graphics show you. But I'm not going to get in the weeds of this article, but one section shows that over 50% loss in grassland birds. So there have been some folks who think that these declines are inflated or they have some issues with part of this quantification, and that's totally legit. I believe that these declines are occurring, and even if these numbers are inflated, it's still a shocking number of birds that we've lost. So it's kind of telling us something about something larger that's happening across the world and the landscape. And so I think that that's important to pay attention to. So while some more obscure warblers and small birds that you may not see very often are included in those declines, warblers are one of the groups that were declining, I just wanted to show you the loss in fairly common species. And so there are some grassland species on here which have shown the steepest declines. You see grasshopper sparrow here on the left, 68% decline. Eastern meadowlarks even, species that we consider very, very common, have decreased by 77%, bobwhites by 83%. My little window is covering our other field sparrow over here at 62% declines. And then things like yellow-billed cuckoo and even dickcissel has about a third of those have been lost, which is just shocking. We think of dickcissel even as kind of a generalist in open grassland areas. So this isn't happening to our more obscure species only, it's happening to the fairly common ones as well. So these are North American breeding bird survey trends just for the eastern tallgrass prairie region. That's a bird conservation region. I'll show you that on the next slide of what that boundary is. But you see these pretty steep declines across that bird conservation region, which is an ecoregion, over that time frame from about 1966 to 2015. And so it's not just happening at the region level, but also in the state. But this is that region I was talking about. So Eastern Tallgrass Prairie is Bird Conservation Region, BCR 22. So you see that green outline of Eastern Tallgrass Prairie. That's what they're talking about, because birds don't stay within the boundaries of a state. So folks across that ecoregion, conservation partners across that ecoregion, work together for grassland birds or birds that use that ecoregion. So the major ones that cover Missouri are 22, which are Eastern Tallgrass Prairie, 24, which are the central hardwoods, and then our boot heel is part of 26, which is the Mississippi Alluvial Valley Bird Conservation Region. So these trends aren't only happening at the region level, but at the state level as well. So these are breeding bird survey trends from that same time frame, just for Missouri, and we see pretty steep declines, a little bit more variation just because of a smaller sample size, but pretty steep declines in a lot of these fairly common species. So the bird plan is just for the state. There are large-scale continental hemispheric conservation plans for different types of birds. So Partners in Flight, I'll explain to you what they are. in a few slides, but Partners in Flight has a land bird conservation plan at the hemispheric level. They work across Canada, the US, Mexico, and even Central America and South America. So they focus on land birds, which again are species that spend most of their time on their life cycle on land. And then there's also water bird conservation for the Americas plan. That's across the Western Hemisphere. So we have these large scale plans that are sometimes a little hard for states to chip away at and pick out the things that could be the most impactful at a state scale. So then those are stepped down to regional plans. So the Upper Miss Great Lakes Joint Venture is a joint venture. It's a group of conservation partners working together for conservation across multiple of those BCRs, including Eastern Tallgrass Prairie. So they have multiple different conservation plans for waterfowl, water birds, shorebirds, and a land bird plan. So all of those continental plans are stepped down to a regional plan. Here is my beautiful image to show you how things are stepped down. So it goes from continental to regional to our state plan. So we didn't have a state plan for land birds. And so that's what we're trying to achieve here with the bird conservation plan. So bird declines. Our birds face many threats. You may be thinking, well, why have birds decreased so drastically over this time frame? So they face many threats, especially migratory birds. They spend up to 8 months of the year somewhere else outside of our borders. So they could be facing threats along the migratory route, down the wintering grounds. There's just myriad effects that these birds can be facing. But the large ones that are assumed across the ornithological world, but it's hard to find a smoking gun on some of that research, is land use changes at a large scale and loss of habitat or degradation of habitat. Many of us know that especially for grassland birds across the agricultural landscape, or native prairie and native grassland, the landscape looks totally different than it used to. With the aggregation of small farms, less shrubby habitat along the edges, or even just open grasslands, an increase in pesticide use really ramped up over these past few decades, which affects, of course, these birds' prey abundance. You know, all birds during the breeding season feed insects to their young, especially, except for goldfinches. But all the other ones are eating bugs out there, insects on the landscape. So those pesticides at a widespread scale and the amount that they're being used and increase surely affects prey abundance. Climate change can change ranges of birds, push them north, or tighten ranges, constrict them, make them smaller, based on severe weather patterns and this warming temperatures. Habitat removal and degradation, loss of habitat, and then also reduction in management or disturbance, meaning removal of trees from open woodlands that some of these species require. They need that open woodland rather than a forest with that shrubby component underneath, and that requires tree removal and it requires prescribed fire to maintain that type of habitat for those species. So many different things at play here. But lack of land management and habitat loss is one of many challenges that birds face, but it's also one that conservation partners and landowners can directly impact. We can improve habitat for our most threatened species. It's just, what are those and what can we do for them? And that's what the bird plan aims to answer. So who the heck made this thing? Our bird plan technical team. So we reached out to people in agencies and groups that manage land and that have staff that have technical knowledge of bird response to management. We needed to sit in a room, look at all these regional species that are of regional concern and step those down to Missouri, saying, do we need them in the Missouri plan? What threats do they face here? How does this species respond when you manage land like this, A, B, or C? We needed all the bird nerds, all the technical bird nerds in the state to come together to form the technical team. So we spoke with these agencies and organizations. We asked them to do their homework beforehand. For instance, Missouri River Bird Observatory is a great partner and they do our grassland bird counts. So we asked them, please look through your grassland bird data, bring that stuff. Here are the species we're considering. Look through that, look through your data and bring that good information because that's what we need to sit and hash out. So we brought together experts from these agencies and then we had input and edits on the plan by others as well. So this is not an MDC plan, a Missouri Department of Conservation plan. It's a Missouri plan. So we brought together a lot of the people we needed to talk to who had the knowledge and really broke this down. So partners in flight scores. When I say we assigned a Missouri concern score, we're stepping those down from partners in flight scores. Partners in Flight is a group of groups that focuses on full life cycle conservation of land birds. That means, again, it's people across Canada, the US, Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and South America that really provides them all a platform to all come together at meetings, network, and talk about how we can protect birds, migrants, throughout their full life cycle, when they're up on the breeding grounds, when they're migrating, and then when they're down on the wintering grounds, what can we do to protect them all throughout that life cycle? So they focus on a lot of different things like science, education, conservation, research. And they also maintain the ACAD, which is the Avian Conservation Assessment Database, which is a massive database that scores every single land bird in North America. So I will tell you, I will break down these nerd-tastic scores for you in the next few slides. But we really needed to be this tedious to really pore over this and figure out which species to include in the plan and what threats they were facing here in Missouri. So the ACAD, this database, includes scores by species, a global score and a regional score. So we were stepping that down to a state score. So this is the awesome database that is the ACAD. And this is just a screenshot. I'm not going to go through this, but I'm going to explain to you how in-depth these scores are. So each species has an addition of 6 scores. You see that PS-G, that means population size at a global level. Then there's breeding distribution at a global level, non-breeding distribution. All of these things can face different threats, and all those are scored 1 to 5, 5 being the most threatened. They also look at threats to breeding, threats to non-breeding, because those are very different depending on the species. And then population trend, how steeply are they declining, are they increasing? All of these things with regional experts and global experts, they sit down, hash this out, assign all these species scores, and then they add up to a continental combined score or overall threat score pretty much. Then they do all this again, stepping it down to a regional level, because again, these birds face different threats at a regional level sometimes than they do at a global level. So they do all that for regional as well, and it adds up to that regional combined score. So this regional score is what we looked at initially and what we stepped down to that state score. This whole talk will not be this technical. So when we determine a Missouri concern score, again, we're mostly looking at land birds. We compared those bird conservation regions, those BCRs in Missouri, you can see here on the map, 22, 24, and 26, which are Eastern Tallgrass Prairie, Central Hardwoods, and Mississippi Alluvia Valley, and determined a step down Missouri concern score. The scores were agreed upon by consensus. We spent 9 hours one day going through 30-something species and scored each one. So it was very tedious, but I thought it was awesome. Okay, so how do we choose the species? What list did we start from? We didn't start with all species in the state. We started with species that were already on regional watch list species for each BCR. So we considered BCR 26 as well, the boot heel. But the big bulk of our state is 22 and 24. So we looked at regional watch list species that were priorities in those 2 BCRs and went from there. I'm not going to go through all of these designations of what scores means they're on a regional watch list, but it means their regional combined scores over 13. These are the most threatened species, and that's what we wanted to focus on to step down to say, are these threatened in Missouri as well? Should we keep them on the list, and what should their score be? I'm not even going to read this, and you're probably looking at me with this face. But our point is that it was a data-driven process. We stepped this down from regional genius minds who poured through all of these scores. We stepped that down from regional work, and we did not reinvent the wheel. We didn't just sit around and say, I like prairie warblers, I think we should include them in the plan. No, they were already regionally threatened. So we included them, determined if we should keep them, and stepped them down and gave them a score. So again, clearly this was tedious, but it was necessary to make this technical section. So the plan is organized by natural community. Grasslands, savanna woodland, and young forest birds, which we understand the savanna woodland and young forest are very different, and that one is an age class and not even a natural community. But the point is those species are either shrub obligates or they need those very open wooded habitats like savanna woodland or young forest for breeding. And so we're trying to make this accessible to both private landowners and land managers. So if I'm a grassland manager, I can just go into the bird plan, open it up, and just look at the grassland birds. Just look at the grassland threats, just look at what these 6 species need in grassland in particular, maybe try and find ways that we can improve management or change management to focus on habitat characteristics that these species needs. So we tried to make it as accessible as possible to managers. We also wrote the plan simply enough to understand that if you're not even in the conservation realm and you're a private landowner and you're just interested in helping wildlife, we gave lots of intros to the plan to show how important this work is, to try and make it as accessible as possible to anyone. So each section, each natural community has an intro where we talk about overall broad threats to that actual natural community, but then we also talk about threats to the species they're in. And then we have species accounts. We have a little species account for all 29 species that are in the bird plan. We give their conservation designations. You see that under the Henslow sparrow, you see watch list yellow, things like that, regional stewardship species and which BCR. And then we say their score, the broad management guidelines, and then other points of interest for their conservation in the bullet points underneath. So these are all the species that are in the plan. I'm not going to go through them very quickly. Okay, fine, I will. No, I'm not. There's 29. And so when we look at just the ones that are grassland birds, the ones above the text are grassland species. So about a third of the species in the plan require either grassland or open land management, which again, you see on the bottom, prairie warbler, eastern towhee, blue-winged warbler, and yellow-breasted chat. Those all require some sort of shrub component, but in an open landscape. At the top, you see dick, sisel, henslow sparrow, grasshopper sparrow, eastern meadowlark, bobolink, field sparrow, and bobwhite. And those all require grassland, very open areas. And so you see this very apparent need for grassland management and maintenance and conservation of those natural communities in particular. So to wrap up this portion, we want to target management. That is the point of the bird plan, is to, it's written for land managers, is to target all the good work we're doing across the state. How can we kind of tweak that or focus in those efforts for our most threatened species? And then what the heck do they need? You know, we've been talking for a long time. Land birds need our protection. Land birds are declining. But managers really didn't have any context for, okay, well, how threatened are they and what the heck should I do for them? And I don't think private landowners have that reference either. So this is really hope to serve as a guide to those folks. We built it with land management partners. It's a Missouri plan for everyone. And again, it outlines our most threatened species, assigns a score, and then tells you how to manage for their breeding habitat. And it's organized by natural community type. So the second section of the bird plan, which is almost wrapped up, it's not complete yet, but I'm hoping in the next few weeks, is the outreach section, which was very different, but just as important. So we're wrapping up that second half, and it took a totally different group of people to write the outreach section, which makes sense. You don't want the technical people in the room. Some of the people were the same, but we brought together a completely different suite of species. You can see the partners down here on the bottom. I forgot to actually double check that all of those partners were the ones that were there, but we had one rep from every Audubon chapter in the state. We had our outreach representatives from Missouri Department of Conservation and from Missouri State Parks, because they have lots of great naturalists and educational folks. Missouri River Bird Observatory, MOBSE, the St. Louis Zoo, our Missouri Birding Society, previously Audubon Society of Missouri, the Audubon Center at Riverlands. We wanted to bring together anyone who talks to the public about birds and bird conservation and bring them in the same room. What we did with the outreach section is we wanted to outline those high-level bird conservation messages for the public that we want to all tell them together with a unified voice. We wanted to identify how each group on the team could plug into these resources. The point here was not clearly to dictate what everyone should talk to the public about birds, but what are areas where we can be stronger and more effective together in talking to them. And here is what we came up with. Don't laugh, but birds are awesome. So here's what we came up with. We came up more with a communication strategy where we say birds are awesome, or birds are valuable, or birds are important to our everyday life, whichever facet you want to take. Birds are awesome, birds are declining, because I think a lot of the public don't know that birds are declining at the level that they are. And then a call to action. Here's what you can do at various scales. So birds are awesome. We talk about each group can tailor this to their audience and their goals that was there as part of the outreach team or anyone in the state. So when we say birds are awesome, I don't just mean they're awesome, but they are. But focus in on their ecological roles, their great beauty, how birding and bird watching is an economic driver, how birds save us money through their ecological roles. However the partner wants to focus in on that, that's the point, is that birds are valuable, but they're also declining. So communicate that net loss, declining populations for a variety of reasons, and how can we help with that? That call to action. Here's what you can do to help. And people can do a lot of different things to help on a variety of scales. So when the science article came out about the broad bird declines in September, they worked with Cornell Lab of Ornithology marketing folks to kind of produce a suite of infographics and information that they could point people to as the paper came out. So rather than saying birds are declining by 30%, and that's all, they said birds are declining by 30%. And here's are some things that you can do to help. So they came up with some infographics to help spread the word in a beautified manner with these pretty infographics, even though it has sad information on it. But then they also focus on the positives, right? That conservation works. Thanks to conservation, there are 15 million more raptors since 1970. Due to conservation efforts, there are 35 million more waterfowl on the landscape. So trying to identify the positives, trying to use that call to action to tell people what they can do next. They also had a website called 3billionbirds.org that they released at the same time. It's the number 3billionbirds.org. I think our great MPF partners are going to provide you with a list of links as a follow-up so that you guys can look this stuff up online. But the 3billionbirds.org outlines 7 simple actions. They focused on 7 easy peasy things that you can do to help birds. Those are make windows safe, because window collisions are a big deal. Keep cats indoors, because cats kill a lot of wild birds. Less lawn, plant natives. Avoid pesticides, drink shade-grown coffee, use less plastic, and watch birds and share what you see. Put your observations on eBird, join the Breeding Bird Survey or Christmas Bird Count. Add your knowledge out there. So they have some more in-depth handouts, and this is Cornell Lab of Ornithology. All this stuff is found on 3billionbirds.org. But they gave you tools to spread the word and to tell people how they can help. So these are the same 7 simple actions. They're just broadened a little bit more. And you can even delve in deeper on their website and look for this, take it further. So not only can you mark the outsides of your windows at your home if you find birds underneath your window, but work with businesses or larger buildings in urban areas. I know that our partners at Missouri River Bird Observatory are doing a lot of that in Kansas City and St. Louis, and that's great, great work. Okay, so the 3 I'm going to focus on today, just to touch on a few, is to plant native plants, shrubs, and trees on your property. Now, if you have acreage, you have a larger area to work with. On the MDC site in particular, you see that yellow box around contact and engage. If you go to our website, you can just hover over that and put in your county and look for your private land conservationists. And you don't have to just do all this work and change your property out of the goodness of your heart. There are a lot of cost share programs so that you can be paid to change your land to make it a little bit more bird friendly if you're able to do that. And also our great Grow Native website that is run by our Missouri Prairie Foundation partners. They have an awesome page called Support Native Songbirds. They came out with this really neat handout that talks about how many insects our native plants and trees support. It's really mind-blowing. So I encourage you to go there and plant natives at any scale. You can put them on a pot on your porch. If you live in an apartment, you can put them in your small backyard. You can plant a huge field, lots of acres. You can do all these things at many different scales. So there's always something we can do. Okay, window strikes again. Mark your windows on the outside to prevent window strikes. If you see birds dead during migration or other times of year, it means you have a problem window, which just means that the bird sees a reflection of the outdoors. It either sees sky or trees or leaves and thinks it can fly through. And then even if a bird sits there for a while and ends up flying off, it could die in the next few days. So this is an important one. It's a super easy one to fix. All About Birds, the Cornell Lab site has a lot of really great resources. I can't really recommend a product, but there are a lot of great products out there to put on the outside of your windows to make sure that they can see it, to break up that reflection. And then market-based conservation. This is one of my favorites because you don't even have to change anything really massive about your life. It's really where we're putting our money, where our mouths and our hearts are for bird conservation. So I have done this as well. I only buy bird-friendly coffee because it's something near and dear to my heart. So I encourage you guys, I challenge you guys to really look at things like coffee or bird-friendly beef, or if that's something that you can handle or if you can afford it, you may want to put a few more bucks to that. You may not know what shade-grown coffee is. I'm just going to take a minute to tell you about that because it's a topic near and dear to my heart. But shade-grown coffee means that they're growing coffee, the little green plants you see there on the chart, under trees in the shade. It's grown in shade, shade-grown. So you can see this gradient here from old growth at the top, which is like the ideal scenario where we have lots of strata and native trees up over above the coffee plants on the bottom. And then it goes down to where the coffee plants are a monoculture at the very bottom. It's like our corn or soybeans where they don't provide a whole lot of, well, they don't provide habitat for native birds. And so it's just growing the coffee in shade also makes a higher quality and better tasting coffee, believe me. And so when you increase shade, the number of species that can use that strata over top certainly increases. 1/3 of all birds that breed in Missouri leave the country completely to overwinter in Mexico, Central America, or South America, or the Caribbean. And so that's a lot of birds going from a very large area in Canada and the US down to a very tiny area on their overwintering grounds. So they have to smash in somewhere, and they're smashing into those trees to forage during migration and over the winter. So they need that canopy above to forage in. If trees are removed at the bottom there, they don't have anywhere to forage. So it's very important, long scale over their full life cycle when they're not here breeding. This is a way to protect them and help support that work. So on the left, you see shade or sun coffee here. And then on the right, you see shade grown coffee. You can see the little shrubs underneath the trees there, and that's shade grown. So there's lots of resources about this online, ways you can do a little more research. Smithsonian Institute also has a certification program for different coffee companies. So if you're interested in this and you're wondering where to go or what coffee to buy, here are a few pictures of a female summer tanager and a Blackburnian warbler that are on coffee plants. Isn't that fitting? So that was provided by allaboutbirds.org off their website, which is a great resource. Okay, how about some optimism? I'm at 30 minutes and 50 seconds, so I'm not going over too badly, but I know this is a lot. The declines are tough to see, but this is very important work. And I really challenge everybody to use the momentum of this article that came out and these bird declines that we know about as a call to action. Any of us can do many, many things for migratory birds and resident birds at a multitude of scales. So there's something all of us can do. So I challenge you to look at the 7 simple actions. I challenge you to look at the bird plan. I feel that the bird plan is inherently optimistic. It really brings together the necessary partners to say, okay, here are our most threatened birds, and this is what the heck we need to do to fix this, to help them, to create more breeding habitat. And so I challenge you to take a look at the bird plan. It will be included in the links that MPF sends out to you. Take a look at it, share it with folks who have acreage or a lot of property or other public land managers. And I really challenge you to look at where do you fit and what you can do to help, because no doubt these birds really need our help, and there's so many things that we can do to help. So that's the bird plan in a nutshell. I thank you so much for your attention. It's very nice of you to spend 30 minutes listening to me talking about a conservation plan. So Felicia, if anyone has any questions, I am happy to try to answer those.
Felicia and Sarah, this is Carol David. I'm the director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and we do have quite a number of questions. Sarah, your talk was wonderful, and I will go through as many of these questions as we can get through. There were some questions about where to get shade-grown coffee, and I think the question came right before you talked about it, but I did share Audubon's link of how to choose bird-friendly coffee. Yeah. If you want to talk a little bit more about that.
So Audubon, that's a great site to look at. Again, I can't really give like an exact supplier, even though I have one in mind that folks should buy from. But yeah, there are lots of good resources online. The Smithsonian Institute certifies that coffee, and they're very reliable. So I would just if you just do a Google search of either the Smithsonian Institute or shade-grown coffee, you'll find a lot of different suppliers. Just because it's shade grown doesn't always mean it's the best for birds. So you might want to Google bird friendly coffee. That might be a better route to take. But yeah, you can pretty easily find suppliers on there. And I know that the Smithsonian I was on a different webinar a few days ago, they said that demand has not been keeping up with supply. So we need more people to buy shade-grown coffee, bird-friendly coffee, to really make more of an impact there. So good question.
And I'd also add, there was a comment from Michael Gold that, of course, a lot of grocery stores carry it too. Just look for the label. Look at the labeling on there can be coffee in your local grocery store, perhaps. On a similar line, Angie's asking about, explain what bird-friendly beef is.
So bird-friendly beef, so there are quite a few suppliers who, the Audubon Conservation Ranching Program is one supplier of that. I know that Carol, you said that you purchased another kind, so you might want to chime in on that in a moment. But again, just try to do your research. What bird-friendly beef is it's ranchers adhere to certain habitat improvements. They have to meet certain habitat improvements or habitat conservation work on their property to help birds, or it could be grazing. Number of head of cattle is less, just different. I clearly am not the person to speak to exactly what the requirements are, but it's ranchers who adhere to certain habitat management practices on their property that are helpful to breeding birds. Carol, do you have any other comments?
Well, I was just going to say, well, I happen just at my local farmer's market, there's an individual, she actually raises beef on prairie grass, but what I would say is if you can't find it in your grocery store, don't get frustrated. Ask in the store, ask that they carry local Audubon bird-friendly beef. And that's how we make changes, is through consumer demand. And so if you don't find it in your grocery store, ask for local Audubon bird-friendly beef to be carried. And the more consumer requests that retailers get, that's how we change things.
Yep, absolutely. And I would just chime in, Carol, that I would do the same thing at your coffee shops or coffee roasters. I would talk to the folks there who do the purchasing of the beans and talk to them about shade-grown bird-friendly coffee, because they may just not be aware.
Very good. And again, I would focus on the bird-friendly part, just because I guess all shade-grown is maybe not created equal.
Yeah, there is a difference for sure.
Okay, there were a number of questions about, well, going back to some of the first questions, a couple of people concerned because I haven't seen any Nightjars, haven't heard them yet this year. I know anecdotally some other folks have heard them, but maybe you could speak about Nightjars and explain what Nightjars are for people who may not know. Yeah,
Nightjars are goat suckers, are capra-mulgas, they're whippoorwills, they're Chuck Will's widows. Chuck Will's widows. So they're those two species who are, in that family, Capra-mulgidae, and they have declined quite drastically over that time frame. You know, a lot of people, if you grew up in a rural area or on the edge of a rural area, you had a whippoorwill sitting right outside your window, calling all night long. I know my parents are both from St. Louis, and when they moved to the country, they were very annoyed by it. So a lot of people who grew up hearing that bird a lot, whippoorwills in particular, don't hear them anymore. And so they've declined quite a bit, and they're not exactly sure why. They're aerial insectivores. They catch insects on the wing. They're very active during full moons because they're nocturnal, and they can see insects better during full moons. But they're just really cool birds. They're doing a lot of research. A lot of different researchers and universities are trying to study their declines, where they're going in the non-breeding season. They're migratory. So they're trying to figure out what challenges they're facing on migration and in overwintering, but also up here during breeding. So a lot of people don't hear them as much anymore. I'm not sure if that's because of increased pesticide use, just declining or decreasing the number of insects that are on the landscape. You know, just driving around even 10, 20 years ago, you don't see as many insects as you do on your windshield during the summer, things like that. So I think there are some broad, large scale changes like that, especially with insects happening, that clearly have systemic changes. It could also be removal of timber and stuff like that around some of our ag and rural areas. They're still all over the Ozarks where there's a lot of that contiguous forest. So yeah, ornithologists aren't really sure what's going on there, but they're studying it.
Great, thanks. There were a couple questions about how people can find the whole plan, and I did share the technical section that you provided, but if there is a way for people to access the entire plan, I think there are some folks interested in that.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. I'm not done with the outreach section yet. I still have to do final tweaks and things like that. But once that's complete, we will share it with all of our partners. Perhaps, Carol, you can send out the link of the entire plan to everyone once it's complete. But yes, we will do a big push once that's done, maybe do a news release about the entire bird plan being finished. So we'll push that through MDC channels, and all of our partners hopefully will talk about their involvement and that it's complete. So we do plan on sending that out, and hopefully we can disseminate that to a lot of the partners' audiences. Yeah.
Great. Yes, we will. Felicia has all the registrants' emails. So Felicia will send some immediate resources out tomorrow morning, but then for the whole plan, we can follow up with that later. There were a number of questions about what individual landowners, homeowners can do, and I'm going to try to combine a few questions here. So one is there a way to step down the state plan to at the landowner level? And I know what you said, that this plan is really for land managers, maybe, and you did allude to some information that was geared to landowners, but can it be driven down to the landowner level via different cost share programs? Another question about, what can a homeowner do in a suburban setting? We did talk about choosing native plants, and I shared some other resources.
Great. Yeah.
I did share, in addition to that, Help Songbirds, the Grow Native program also recently developed a Hosts with the Most card, and I shared a link to that. That's the genera of native plants that support the greatest number of butterfly moth caterpillars, so they're good bird food factories. So again, can you talk about, from the landowner level, and then there was also a question about negative impacts of feral cats, free-ranging house cats, which does kind of get to that as well.
Yep, I can do that. Yes. So as I said, there are so many different things you can do on so many different levels. So if you are in an urban environment, if you live in an apartment or a home with just a really small yard, I would focus on those 7 simple actions from the 3billionbirds.org site. We kind of provide all that information in our outreach section too. We kind of lumped in the 7 simple actions with our calls to action. But I would look at those and really look at what around your home you could improve. Carol, you pretty much already touched on them. Native plants are probably the most impactful long-term thing that you can do, like today, to improve your yard and around your home, just because those native plants, as Carol talked about, they attract native insects, which, birds need all of those insects. I'll use the anecdotal, well, it's not anecdotal, it was a study, but Doug Talmy that, he studied chickadees in his backyard. I know a lot of conservation people know this anecdote, but one clutch of chickadees fed their young, well, not a clutch, but the parents fed one clutch of chickadees 7,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. And that's just one group of nestlings, and you extrapolate that across all the landscape, and it's just really mind-blowing how many insects these birds need. So when you look at the numbers of how many, like an oak, how it provides, it can be a host species to like 400 or 500 native caterpillar species, as opposed to some other non-natives that provide 1 or 2. It really shows that we can make a direct impact by planting native trees over the long term, native plants and shrubs over the short term. So that's a very impactful one. Window strikes are a huge one. They're one of the leading causes of wild bird mortality. So anything you can do to break up those reflections on your sliding glass doors or parts of your house where you get birds banging into them on any regular basis. And again, take that to the next step and talk to businesses. If you see birds sitting on the sidewalk next to large window panes, talk to them about simple things they can do. And you don't have to break up the reflection totally. It's not like you won't be able to see out the window. There are a lot of really good options out there where you can still get a good view out your window. Feral cats and cats that are outdoors. This is a tough one because people feel very strongly about this. It's a hot button issue. But American Bird Conservancy, ABC, has a great website about cats and wild birds. Cats are the leading cause of wild bird death. Free roaming and just letting cats outside. And so there are options for catios, which are patios for your cat, which means just a screened-in area where the cat could still enjoy time outside, and it's not a danger to birds under feeders or just out and about in your yard or on adjacent property. So, so that's a big one if you're willing to do that. But there's a lot of information online about that you could look at. But I'd say in an urban area or suburban area, I think the best things you can do are windows, change your purchasing habits like we talked about with shade grown or bird friendly beef, and window strikes and native plants. So yeah, I think those are big ones. And if you have property, yeah, reach out to a private land conservationist with the conservation department. That's what they do. I mean, you can just call them and bend their ear and ask them a bunch of questions about options for you on your property. Sometimes they'll come out and check your property, come up with a plan for you. That's what they're there for, is to help wildlife, including birds. So we're coming up with some programs within the department or materials to focus more on landowners wanting to manage their property with cost share programs just for birds, because they are a big draw. A lot of people are bird watchers or enjoy wildlife watching who don't necessarily need to manage their property for deer and turkey, but everything you do for deer and turkey is also great for a suite of bird species. So it kind of doesn't matter what you're managing for wildlife wise, there's always a way that birds can fit into that as long as you're managing it for wildlife. So I would reach out to private land conservationists. I can't talk more specifically on cost share because that's just not my background, but that's what they're there for. I really encourage you guys to reach out to them if you have acreage and are willing to change a little bit of it to improve wildlife habitat.
Sarah, I'll just add that folks can, if you don't know who your private land conservationist is, where you live in the state, if you go to the Missouri Department of Conservation website and then under something, there's a link like, what can I do on my property? I'll share it in a moment, or we'll do it tomorrow. Then you put in you kind of scroll to your county, I think, and then the names will come up. Yep. So that is a really great place to get information. Another question related to landowner, we already haven't mowed because milkweed is coming up and because of nesting birds. If I wait until the monarchs leave, my pastures, these are horse pastures, go completely wild. Is that what landowners are doing?
Yeah, that's a hard one. It's hard to talk to folks who are trying to hay on their property and get income from their property and ask them to just not hay or mow for the benefit of birds. So I understand that. I understand that, folks are living off their land and making income. And so you have to find either cost share or some balance there. I know that folks can't just do all of this out of the goodness of their heart, but I think that there's things that everybody can do to improve parts of their land, whether it's you don't mow the whole pasture or there are options there. But yeah, it's a tough one. It's a tough one when it's hard for me to just ask landowners to just not hay or mow. But I think that there are options you can do, or leave part of the field or something like that for nesting birds. But that is a tough one. That's a really, really tough question. But I think that I do think that even still reaching out to your private land conservationists, they're going to have ideas for you because that's what they're steeped in. That's what they're trained to do, is come up with options for folks who face those challenges. Yeah, if you're willing to help and do anything for wildlife, we can figure out a way to improve parts of your property for sure.
Someone had a question early on about, can Sarah talk briefly about the tracking system that has been installed in certain areas of the state?
Yes, so that's the Modus wildlife tracking system. I was smiling because I think it's so awesome. And what that is it's a network of nano tags that you place on birds. And I just say nano tags because they're very tiny. It's a new technology that ranges from 0.2 to 2.5 grams. These are little receivers you put on the backs of these little birds, like this blue-winged warbler you see here. It's a new technology that's available to put on birds, 8 to 10 grams tiny. And so it's really able to teach us a lot about long distance movements of small animals, of migrants. So you put these little nano tags on the backs of these birds, and then you place these semi-permanent receivers on the landscape. So previously I'm gonna try and keep this brief, but previously with radio tracking, you would place little transmitters on your birds, set them on a set frequency so that you could listen for the transmissions on that set frequency. You'd collect that data, you'd track your birds around a set habitat during the breeding season, say. You'd collect that data, and then you would publish or do something with that data. Carol, if she was doing a study on her birds, she would attach transmitters to her birds on her study area on a different frequency. She'd collect those data and then publish or whatever. And so we would all be working separately off of different frequencies. Well, now they're using these tiny transmitters on migratory birds right before migration. And there's a series of over 900 receivers in the whole world under MODIS. They're MODIS receivers that all work on the same frequency. So if Carol releases birds in Maine right before migration, if it passes within her receivers up in Maine, all the way down the East Coast along receivers, and they cross my receivers here in Missouri, and then down in Central America, you're getting pings off of all of those receivers all the way along their migratory route. So it's a collaborative new approach to different researchers working together on the same frequency. That's just what's revolutionary about it, is that before we would all have our own data on these different frequencies. Well, now we have bird tracking across this entire frequency. I could give a whole nother 45-minute talk just on MODIS, but I don't think you want that right now. But we have 9 active MODIS receivers in Missouri. We're working to put up 2 digital fences in the state. What I mean by digital fence is the detection diameters of each receiver overlap slightly, so that we're gonna have a line of them kind of along Highway 60 in the Ozarks through a lot of that big bulk of breeding habitat in our Ozarks, and then a line of them across Highway 36 in the northern half of the state, so that in theory, we could put tags on birds north or south, and any MODIS tagged bird or bat or animal that flies across Missouri, we will have data on it. So the state of Pennsylvania did this, and most of the receivers are in the northeastern part of the US, and it's a project out of Canada. So there are a lot of receivers in Southeast Canada around the Great Lakes. And so we're really trying to beef up the number of receivers in the Midwest because they are lacking. So it's a little bit about that, sorry.
Okay, so I posted modis.org, the website, so people could learn more. A couple questions on some other threats. One is on light pollution and on wind turbines.
Yes, so light pollution is a biggie, especially during migration. Light pollution and studies on that are admittedly not my background, but there are a lot of great resources online, and there's a big lights out program. I'm fuzzy right now on the exact name of the program, but a Google search, ABC has been doing a lot, American Bird Conservancy has been doing a lot about that, and programs to contact large buildings or cell companies that have lights, constant lights on their towers, to try and have them switch to a blinking light or intermittent light, which actually saves them money. But lights that blink that aren't on constantly, I believe, are less attractive to migrants, so fewer of them run into the towers. So I encourage you to, I hate to just point people to research that, but I am not steeped in that topic, but there's a lot of good work going on. And there's many things you can do if you're part of an Audubon chapter or a group, if that makes you stronger with that group voice, to reach out to cell companies and other people to ask them, because it does make a big difference. It decreases collision deaths a lot. Wind turbines are another thing. No doubt they kill a lot of birds there, but there are a lot of studies that are very inconclusive on the exact number of birds that any one wind turbine kills. It's hard to get an exact estimate on that because scavengers hang out underneath wind turbines. So unless you have someone camped out sitting underneath a wind turbine 24/7, it's hard to get an accurate count, because the following morning, if you come after nighttime and birds or bats were killed at nighttime, it's hard to know and get a good count. So there's a lot of research papers that some people think are very inflated and some that think they're very small. But compared to window collisions and cats, wind turbines are hardly even on the map to contributions to wild bird deaths. So no doubt they get some, but I don't believe it's on a level that is impacting populations widespread.
Sarah, I'll add that the Missouri Prairie Foundation has spearheaded Energy Infrastructure Conservation Siting Working Group. And this is a group of some individuals from different areas of environmental law and conservation groups. And our goal is to develop some guidelines, statewide guidelines, because right now there aren't any guidelines that exist.
Yeah.
So it's a slow process, but we are working on that. And then there's another question about managing prairies to benefit bird species. And I would just like to add, if I may, Sarah, that, I think it's important to just to point out that there aren't any prairie birds per se. There are other species that are tied exclusively to prairie, that are prairie dependent, whereas there are grassland birds that do occur in prairies, but they can use some other grassland types. So I just wanted to preface that, and the work of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, we work to really focus on those prairie dependent species, because if we lose prairies, we will lose those species. That said, grassland species, including birds, are extremely important to us, and the work that we do for those prairie dependent species also benefits the grassland birds. But so I just wanted to provide a little bit of context about what the Prairie Foundation does. And Sarah, you want to talk more about managing prairies to benefit bird species the most?
Yeah, you would probably be able to speak to grasses in particular. In the bird plan, we did provide broad management guidelines by species, because especially in grassland systems, they are very different by species, which is kind of great and cool, because if you provide a mosaic and diversity of management on your property or on your grasslands, you appeal to, again, that diversity of different species. So rotation of management, whether that's rotating burning and different other management tools in different parts of your field. So for instance, grasshopper sparrows need bare ground in the grass. So they will use areas that are a little bit more open on the floor, because they need those open areas. Whereas a Henslow sparrow likes rank, thick grass that hasn't been bird for 3 years plus. And so there's different species, even within grassland. There's really no one prescription for grassland birds. You can't just say, oh, well, I'll just do this one management regime and it'll appeal to all of them. That's not really the case. So that's hard too, because you can't manage your land for just one species. But if you diversify and maybe break up your property into rotations of different management, it will appeal to a broader suite of species. So that's all in the plan as well. So I would encourage you to look through that if you're interested in that. But I think a diversity of management across the landscape in any of these natural communities is good for clearly a diversity of birds.
And along those lines, Sarah, there's a question. We have areas set aside on our farm where we haven't mowed for several years. We have sumac and other shrubby plants establishing themselves. Is it better to mow the shrubby plants or leave them? And I also have a couple links that I'll share as well, but if you can address that, Sarah, while I look for my links.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on if you're in a landscape, if you're in a grassland dominant landscape and you have a lot of open grassland around you, and you have a parcel of that in the middle of that, I wouldn't let that go to shrubby stuff. I mean, on a lot of our landscape scale conservation efforts with the department, in our priority geographies, if we're in a priority geography, which is just a priority area within the state, in a grassland one, if we acquire new property, we're really trying to remove trees on those properties if it's a grassland landscape. We don't want to break up all of that open grassland, native grassland landscape. So it just kind of depends on where you're situated in the landscape. If you're on a predominantly grassland open landscape, it might be more useful for you to mow those shrubs and maintain that open kind of contiguous landscape. If you have kind of a diversity of habitats on your property anyway, you could let them grow up and then eventually mow them. But if you have a shrubby component, that's going to help all those species in that middle section of the bird plan, like this blue-winged warbler right here on the picture, prairie warblers, blue-winged warbler, yellow-breasted chat, peewees, a lot of those species well, pewee's just like really open woodland, so they have room to forage. But these other species are shrub obligate for breeding. They only put their nests in shrubs. They need that shrubby component. So it just kind of depends on if you're talking about if you have like a 5, 6, 10 acre area that you're growing up into shrubs, that could be really good for prairie warblers, and they need that early successional kind of shrubby component. So that could be good for them as well, but eventually it'll grow up really thick and it won't be as useful. So it just kind of depends on what your long-term goals are, but sorry, I can't be more specific on what you should do.
Sarah, if I could also add, in fact, in the summer 2020 issue of the Missouri Prairie Journal, which I'm frantically working on now, there's going to be a really long a really comprehensive article about the phenomenon of grasslands becoming shrubbier. And some of it has to do with climate change and weather patterns and a host of other things. So that will provide some really good information. If you're a member of the Prairie Foundation, you get that in your mailbox. It'll be accessible online. But there's also, I just posted an article about how land management affects predation on quail, which gives some really good information. It can depend on the arrangement of shrubs. Long, linear rows of shrubs and trees is not good, but kind of islands of shrubs can be very good. But it does depend, as Sarah said, on your context. What your overall management goals are. Like for the Missouri Prairie Foundation, we try to keep shrub islands to be like the size of a car, say. Yep. We don't want to have like acres of shrubs, but we do want to have some shrub component for those grassland birds that need that without impacting, some of the other species that would decline if it was all shrub. So it is a really delicate
It is. Yeah, it is. And I talked about that on the threats part, is habitat degradation due to lack of land management. And that is real. If you have an open grassland that starts to grow up into shrubs and succeed to, a shrubby young forest, that's not useful clearly for grassland birds. And it takes a lot of work and maintenance to keep that a grassland. And the same way with, a lot of these shrub obligate species and species that need woodland and savanna, those very open wooded habitats, they're declining because a lot of those habitats that occurred in the Ozarks and across the state have grown into closed forest. And so they just can't use that habitat anymore because of a lack of management or, natural fire that occurred on the landscape way back when. And so that's why we employ a lot of these prescribed fire regimes in woodland systems. We remove some of those trees, open it up, do prescribed burning every handful of years across those systems to maintain that shrubby component with a canopy above, because it just appeals to a broader diversity of bird species that use all of those layers in those open wooded habitats. So you just have to keep on top of a lot of these natural communities, otherwise they will change to something else. So good point.
Good, sir. And I also just put a plug in for, if you want to look at the webinar we did last week on Missouri's natural communities, I think, Sarah makes a really good point here. It's, each distinct natural community is providing for different bird species. And so it's important to recognize each of those community types and conserve and manage each one of those community types so that we are benefiting all of those birds that are tied to each one of those community types. That's available on Facebook as well. There's another question. If you can keep going, Sarah, we got more questions.
Keep going for a little while longer, yes.
Let's see, there's a question about, will putting screens on windows help reduce the number of birds flying into windows?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Great.
Yeah, if you keep a screen door closed, they'll just bounce off of it. You can also buy netting that you can put on the outside of your windows so that if a bird flies in, it just bounces off and flies away. It's really that hard impact on the glass that's really doing it. So there's a number of options. There's stuff called bird tape, which is kind of opaque adhesive stuff, but you put it on the outside. A lot of people put those raptor silhouettes on the inside of the window, and those can be helpful during certain times of day. But other times of day, birds can't see it because of the glare on the outside of the window. So make sure you're putting stuff on the outside rather than the inside of the window. But yeah, there's a variety of options for things that just break up that reflection or they bounce off of. Yep.
So the screen is more of a physical thing. They bounce off of it. It's not so much that it helps them see the glass. It's more of a physical thing.
But it breaks up that reflection a little bit more, and they can bounce off of it. So it's kind of a double.
Okay. I just mentioned because sometimes people have screens on the inside, you know, if they have like.
Oh, I see.
But anyway.
I don't think on the inside it would break it up as much. And of course, yeah, the screen's on the inside.
And I'll mention for those who live in St. Louis or go to the St. Louis Zoo, when it is open again, there's a candy shop in the St. Louis Zoo that has bird-friendly glass, and it has like it's internal to the glass. It's a pattern, so it's bird-friendly glass. So if you're at the St. Louis Zoo, you might check that out for another example.
Yeah, developers can certainly purchase glass that already has it installed in it. Yeah, so there are options like that too for industry and development for sure.
Great. One other question: what's the status of prairie chickens?
Prairie chickens. So we provided a news release a few months ago. Well, it's probably more than a few months at this point. It's hard to keep track of time anymore. But it was probably 6 months ago, wasn't it, Carol, that we talked about how we won't be reintroducing any more prairie chickens because some of those efforts have just been really difficult just because it's a larger scale effort than what we really have to work with. It's a landscape scale problem of loss of grassland and prairie. That unless we were able to acquire, you know, tens of thousands of contiguous grassland acres, we won't be reintroducing them anymore. There's maintains a breeding population at Dunn Ranch up on the Iowa border. I believe is our most productive breeding population. I think that there are a few birds still sticking around at Taborville. Is that right, Carol? But a lot of our historic populations are kind of decreasing and kind of snuffing out, which is very unfortunate. And, you know, it's kind of a canary in the coal mine for some of these grassland birds. We just don't want to see them go the same route. So, you know, grassland in particular, we just really need more protected lands and just help managing some of those open landscapes for a lot of these species that are just having a hard time.
Okay. Question: how old is this precious young bird watcher on your slide?
He was a lot younger in this picture than he is now, but that's Abram. That's my son. He's now 4. I think he was 2 and something there. So yeah, I'm not pushing it at all. You can tell.
No, he's not proud at all. Another question. I think this is our final question. Can you talk about the introduction of the brown-headed nuthatch in Missouri?
Yes, I can. So we have the Mark Twain National Forest in particular has restored large swaths of shortleaf pine woodland, which is habitat that brown-headed nuthatch requires. So brown-headed nuthatch, there are records of them occurring in Missouri, and the shortleaf pine woodlands that they require, big swaths of, you know, most of our Ozarks historically was shortleaf pine before it was denuded in the early 1900s. And so around that time is assumed when nuthatches no longer occurred in the state because their habitat was removed. But all of that shortleaf pine, big swaths of that habitat occurred from our Ozarks down through Arkansas, which is where our closest population of brown-headed nuthatches is. So they're listed as extirpated in the state. And so we have an opportunity here because the Mark Twain National Forest, the U.S. Forest Service in particular, have restored pine woodlands, large swaths of them down in the Ozarks. And so this topic has been going around for about a decade with a lot of different conservation partners of can we bring them back? Do we have the habitat to bring them back? And so I've been working with our partners at the University of Missouri and the Forest Service to do assessments on our habitat here in the state, whether we have enough, whether it's healthy enough and large enough to support a small population. And we've done assessments on potential source populations down in the Ouachita National Forest and where those populations are they healthy enough to remove birds from? And so we are on track to reintroduce brown-headed nuthatches sometime in August. Of course, COVID and using PPE and social distancing might decrease our ability to make as big of a splash as maybe we were before. It's going to have to be a much kind of a lower key effort, but we're on track to continue doing it, keeping people safe and healthy with social distancing and things like that. So we're on track to do it. We would move 100 birds over 2 years. So we would move 50 this year and then 50 next year. So it's still all on track. It's very exciting, bringing back a species directly linked to habitat restoration efforts that folks have been doing down in that part of the state for, in some areas, up to 20 years. So it's kind of a really cool conservation story of we brought the habitat back, so now we can bring one of our species back too. So.
Follow-up question from Michael. Are you working with Pioneer Forest also on the brown-headed nuthatch?
I know they're doing a lot of shortleaf pine restoration. For our release sites, we have chosen sites that are just within the Forest Service property on the Mark Twain for this coming year. But there are options for next year, and we are talking with a lot of partners and about, you know, broadening those restoration efforts to try and create more habitat. This is not, has potential to not be the only restoration or reintroduction that we do of the species, but we're starting here with a small population and we'll see where we go from there. But I know that Pioneer Forest is doing, yes, a lot of shortleaf pine restoration. So there's a lot of options for the future for sure.
All right, I think that was all the questions. Hope I didn't miss any. And Felicia's gonna grab up all these resources that we talked about. And if Sarah, if you think of anything else that you wanna share that's available now, shoot it over to us. And this will go out tomorrow to all the participants. So thank you, Sarah, so much for all that you do for Grassland, for Grassland Birds and all birds, and for giving this talk.
Well, thank you, Carol, and thanks to MPF for hosting these. We're kind of adapting to different times here, and you guys are doing a great job. You're reaching a bunch of people, and I appreciate the opportunity. It's really nice to be able to talk to such a wide group of people from a house and not at work. So thank you guys for your attention. I appreciate your willingness to tune in.
Great, thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye.